Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this fundamental expectation of precision, yeah.
Like engineering almost.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, the doctor puts you in an x-ray machine, and the film comes back showing that jagged, glowing white line across the bone. And the doctor just points at it and says, well, there it is.
It's binary. Broken or not broken.
Right. It's clean, and honestly, it's comforting. We like things to be visible. We want to be able to categorize our problems, point to the exact source of the pain, and just apply the exact right bandage so we can, move on with our lives.
Makes a quick fix, yeah.
But when you step out of the physical realm and into the world of human nature, of the soul, of our fundamental spiritual condition, that x-ray machine suddenly becomes totally useless.
Oh, completely. It gets very murky.
Yeah, it's murky, it's uncomfortable, and it's deeply contested because we desperately want to believe we just have a slight moral fracture, right? Like maybe a little spiritual sprain that we can fix with some self-help physical therapy.
Right, a little meditation, and we're good to go.
Exactly. But what happens when the most renowned spiritual diagnostician of the 19th century looks at the human soul and just delivers a verdict that completely shatters that comfort? A verdict that says, the patient isn't just sick, the patient is at war with the doctor.
Yeah, that is a jarring pivot.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking, where we take our stack of sources and plunge into the ideas, the theology, and the historical texts that shape our understanding of the universe. To you, the listener, whether you are prepping for a theology seminar or you're just, intensely curious about how the titans of historical thought viewed the human condition, our mission today is to unpack a profoundly disruptive piece of 19th century thought. And we're going to do it without the academic jargon.
That's the goal. And we have a very specific singular source for today's deep dive. We're examining a sermon delivered on April 22nd, 1855 by the legendary Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
Spurgeon.
Yeah, he was speaking at Exeter Hall in the Strand, which was right in the beating heart of Victorian London. And the title of this message, which is anchored in Romans chapter 8, verse 7, is The Carnal Mind Enmity Against God.
We really have to set the stage here to truly appreciate the impact of this text. I mean, it's 1855. Victorian London is the absolute epicenter of the industrialized world.
Right, the height of the empire.
Exactly. Just a few years prior, they held the Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace, celebrating human progress, industry, and, the limitless potential of mankind. There's this overwhelming cultural narrative that humanity is just on this upward trajectory.
Curing diseases, building railroads.
Conquering nature, all of it. And into this atmosphere of supreme human self-confidence walks a 20-year-old Spurgeon.
Just 20 years old. It's wild to think about.
It is. He's speaking to a massive, towering crowd, thousands of people packed into this hall, and he stands up and delivers what can really only be described as a devastating, surgical, and beautifully articulated deconstruction of human pride.
It really is a masterpiece of rhetorical power and theological precision. And our goal today isn't just to look at the theology in a vacuum, but to analyze how Spurgeon forces a radically optimistic culture to confront a profoundly pessimistic truth about its own nature.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we take Spurgeon at his word here, he's making a terrifying claim. The central premise is that human nature isn't just slightly flawed, right?
Right. Not just a little off course.
It's not drifting like a ship that just needs a minor compass calibration. He is arguing that humanity, at its core, is in a state of active, fundamental, unyielding hostility toward its creator.
And to make us feel the gravity of that hostility, he knows he can't just start with the disease. He forces us to look at what the patient used to be before the infection took hold.
Oh, the Eden imagery.
Yes, exactly. He begins with this sweeping cosmic perspective on humanity's fall in Eden. Because before we can understand the tragedy of the ruins, we have to understand the majesty of the original architecture.
The language he uses here is soaring. He contrasts fallen man with original man, and he describes original humanity as being second only to the angels. The companion of God, walking with him in the cool of the day in the garden.
Pure.
Spotless.
Unblemished. Humanity wasn't created in a state of neutral gray mediocrity. It was a masterpiece of divine engineering.
What's fascinating here is how he appeals to our historical empathy to make us feel the weight of what was lost. He uses the tragic imagery of ruined cities.
Right, like Carthage.
Yeah, he brings up the Carthaginian weeping over his beloved city when he saw it reduced to heaps of smoldering rubble by the Romans. And then he brings up the Jew wandering through the deserted, destroyed streets of Jerusalem, mourning that the Roman plowshare had literally marred the beauty of the city.
The joy of the whole word.
Exactly. Spurgeon's logic here is deeply emotional. He's saying, if we can weep over the destruction of a city of stone and mortar, how much more should we mourn the ruins of humanity? Yeah, this creature that was matchless in symmetry, now just lying in a mass of spiritual debris. I was really struck by his analogy of the world on fire.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah, he mentions that a few years before this sermon, astronomers observed a star blazing out with incredible sudden brilliance, and then it vanished. They concluded it was a world on fire thousands of millions of miles away.
Like a supernova or something.
Right. And the light of that cosmic conflagration finally reached Earth, acting as this silent alarm of a burning planet. And Spurgeon asks, what is the destruction of a distant material planet compared to the fall of humanity?
It's a brilliant question of scale, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, we look up at the night sky and feel a sense of awe and tragedy at the death of a star. But Spurgeon says the fall of Adam was our fall. It's our own house that is burning.
We shouldn't be looking through a telescope to find tragedy. We should be looking in a mirror.
Exactly. But he doesn't just leave it at the emotional level of mourning. He transitions into the actual mechanics of this ruin. He introduces this pivotal phrase, the carnal mind.
Yeah, the Greek phrase he references is phronema sarkos. Now, he explains that carnal here signifies fleshly, the natural mind, the soul we inherited from our ancestors. But wait, let's pause and clarify this, because I think a modern listener hears the word carnal and immediately jumps to a very specific, limited category behavior.
Oh, for sure. We think of physical vices.
Yeah, scandalous behavior, gluttony, sexual immorality, things tied directly to the physical body. But Spurgeon is pointing this weapon directly at the intellect and the soul, isn't he?
He absolutely is, and this is where we need to understand the philosophical framework of the Apostle Paul, which Spurgeon is drawing from here.
Okay.
The flesh, the sarx, is not just your skin and bones. It is not just your bodily appetites. The flesh is the default human operating system in its fallen state.
Operating system, I like that.
Yeah, it encompasses human reason, human philosophy, human emotions, and human willpower when they are disconnected from God.
So even the good stuff.
Even the highest intellectual achievements and the most refined moral philosophies, if they are generated by a heart that is autonomous from its creator, that is the carnal mind. It is the very self-same mind that was once holy in Eden, which has now fundamentally inverted its orientation.
Which brings us to what I found to be the most devastating linguistic maneuver in the entire sermon. It's almost a grammar lesson, but one that completely upends how you view yourself.
The noun versus the adjective.
Yes. He focuses on the exact phrasing of Romans 8.7. Paul does not say the carnal mind is opposed to God. He says it is enmity against God. He uses a noun, not an adjective.
The grammar of depravity. It is a terrifying distinction when you really grasp it. Spurgeon asks the listener to consider the difference between a characteristic and an essence.
Right.
He says the carnal mind is not merely black, it is blackness itself. It is not just corrupt, it is corruption. It is not just rebellious, it is rebellion.
I have to admit, I struggled with this initially. Because, if you tell me I have a disease, I can process that. The disease is a foreign invader. It's a virus that got into my system.
There's a separation there.
Exactly. It means there is a me that is separate from the disease, and with the right medicine, the disease can be extracted, leaving the pure me behind. But Spurgeon is saying, I don't have the disease. I am the disease. The entire entity is the infection.
That is exactly the theological horror he is trying to evoke. If it were an adjective, it would mean enmity is just an attribute you possess, right? A bad habit you picked up.
Yeah.
But because it's a noun, it means your fundamental nature in its unregenerate state is composed of hostility toward God. It is evil in the concrete, sin in the essence.
And he pushes the severity of this enmity even further. He says this hostility isn't just directed at God's laws or his authority or his moral framework. It strikes at God's very essence. It's a strike at the person of the Godhead.
Right. It's not a political disagreement over how the universe should be run. It is a fundamental hatred of the ruler himself. Spurgeon argues that if the carnal mind had its way, it would not merely break God's laws, it would annihilate God. It is deicidal in its ultimate trajectory.
Which is an incredibly heavy, almost unthinkable accusation to level against humanity.
Yeah.
You can imagine a respectable Victorian gentleman sitting in the front row at Exeter Hall, wearing a tailored suit, having just donated to an orphanage.
Very proper.
Very proper. And he's listening to this and thinking, I don't hate God. I'm a perfectly nice person. I pay my taxes. I love my family. I don't harbor active hatred in my heart for the creator of the universe. This is hyperbolic.
And Spurgeon knows this pushback is coming.
Yeah, he knows he has just read the most severe indictment possible against the human race. So, having defined this ultimate treason, he steps into the role of a prosecutor. He realizes that if the charge is universal, essential enmity, he must provide undeniable proof.
And he refuses to just take the easy way out. He could have just said, the Bible says so, therefore believe it. Now, he does note that if human reason cannot see the ground of a divine revelation, reason must reverently bow to it. But he doesn't stop at mere theological assertion. He wants to prove it empirically.
So he starts calling witnesses.
Yes, he calls his first witness to the stand, the witness of history and human behavior.
He unrolls the volume of ancient history, and he points out that it is a profoundly bloody scroll. He talks about how mankind has turned the world into an Eseldama,
A field of blood.
a field of blood. And this isn't just ancient history. If we think about the 20th and 21st centuries, we haven't exactly evolved out of this, have we? The industrialization of warfare just made the Eseldama larger.
So much larger.
Spurgeon points to the unending wars, fightings, and murders as external evidence of an internal hostility. He points to the blacklist of vices that whole nations have indulged in. But what I found fascinating is that he doesn't just point to the warlords or the tyrants. He explicitly calls out the most eminent philosophers of antiquity.
The paragons of human reason. The Greeks and the Romans, whose philosophies formed the bedrock of Western education.
Exactly. He says, if we knew the secret lives, the actual private behaviors and crimes committed by the men who are held up as the peaks of human morality, we would blush to even speak of them. He's stripping away the veneer of civilization. He's saying that even when human reason reaches its absolute zenith, it is still married to moral decay.
And from secular history, he pivots to a deeply fascinating second witness, the witness of human religion. He looks at what mankind does when it tries to reach up to the divine on its own terms. He points to the delusions of the heathen, the systems of priestcraft that enthrall souls in superstition.
The dark stuff.
Yeah, he talks about the horrid obscenities and diabolical rites that cultures have historically considered sacred.
He uses this powerful lesser to greater logical argument here. If you look at human sacrifice, or the temple prostitution of antiquity, or the cruel rites of ancient fertility cults, this is humanity's best attempt at religion.
Precisely. His logic is piercing here. If man's highest, most sincere attempt to honor the divine is filled with cruel, besotted, and degrading practices, what must his irreligion be?
Wow, yeah.
If his devotion is this twisted, what is his open rebellion like? If this is how humanity behaves when it is trying to be pious, it serves as undeniable proof that the human mind is fundamentally warped in its understanding of what is good and holy.
So history and natural religion act as the first two witnesses. But then he calls a witness that seems completely counterintuitive. He calls the holiest men who have ever lived the witness of the holy.
You would naturally assume that if anyone could testify in defense of human nature, it would be the saints, right?
Yeah.
The prophets, the apostles,
Yeah.
the people who lived the most exemplary lives.
Right. You would expect them to say, actually, human nature is capable of great purity. Look at our lives. But Spurgeon points out that the exact opposite is true. The holiest men are always the most vocal about their own absolute depravity. He quotes David, the man after God's own heart, writing in the Psalms, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity." He quotes the Apostle Paul, the great missionary of the early church, crying out in Romans 7, "O wretched man that I am."
It forces us to ask why. Why do the most pure individuals feel their impurity the most acutely? Why do the greatest saints confess the greatest sins? Spurgeon provides an analogy that perfectly explains the mechanics of this spiritual self-awareness. He says he whose garments are the whitest will best perceive the spots upon them.
Here's where it gets really interesting because it's such a simple but profound observation. If I am wearing a shirt that I've been wearing for 3 days while doing yard work and it's covered in mud, grease, and grass stains, I'm not going to notice if a drop of coffee falls on it.
It just blends right in.
Exactly. The background is already corrupted. But there if I'm wearing a pristine, bright white tuxedo shirt, that single drop of coffee doesn't just stand out. It looks like a massive, glaring disaster.
And he adds another layer to that analogy. He says, he whose crown shines the brightest will be the first to know when he has lost a jewel. He who gives the most light to the world will always be the most capable of discovering his own darkness.
That makes so much sense.
When a person is brought closer to the absolute holiness of God, their own residual sin becomes magnified. The angels, who are completely sinless, still veil their faces before the throne of God. How much more must the holiest men on earth veil their faces in humility when the light of God's perfection exposes the true nature of their carnal mind?
So we have the blood-stained pages of history, the twisted rites of natural religion, and the agonizing confessions of the greatest saints. But Spurgeon knows that an audience can still distance themselves from all of that.
Oh, people are experts at distancing themselves.
Right, they can say, that's history, that's paganism, that's the apostles, what about me? So he brings the trial directly to the listener. He calls the final, most devastating witness to the stand. He cross-examines the listener's own conscience.
He puts the listener directly in the witness box. And he issues this incredible warning before the questioning begins. He says, "Be not drugged with the laudanum of self-security."
Laudanum, an opium tincture that was wildly popular in Victorian times for dulling pain. He is literally telling them not to drug themselves into a state of false peace.
In a modern context, we might think of the algorithms, the echo chambers, the constant stream of digital entertainment.
He inflicts doom scrolling.
Exactly. Or even modern therapeutic language that we use to anesthetize our sense of guilt. We surround ourselves with noise and validation so we don't have to hear the quiet, terrifying indictments of our own conscience. Spurgeon demands that we strip away that anesthesia.
And when the conscience is awake, he goes straight for the throat with an interpretation of Psalm 14, verse 1, that genuinely made me pause. The traditional translation is, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." But Spurgeon argues that this is fundamentally misunderstood if we view it merely as intellectual atheism.
Yeah, he argues that the original Hebrew implies something much more aggressive. It shouldn't be read as a philosophical statement like, "I have weighed the evidence and concluded a deity does not exist." The translation, according to Spurgeon, is better rendered as a desire. No God. As in, no God for me, I do not want any, I wish there were none.
Okay, I really want to challenge this because this feels like a massive leap. Spurgeon asks the conscience, have you ever wished there were no moral laws to restrain you? Have you ever had a fleeting thought where you wish that all these divine realities, the idea of a judgment, the idea of an all-seeing eye, were just a myth so you could indulge your desires without guilt?
And everyone has to say yes to that.
Right. Every honest person has to admit that, yes, we've all chafed against moral restraint. We have all wished we could get away with something. But Spurgeon uses this to claim that this fleeting thought is a literal proof of cosmic hatred.
Yes, he does.
He says, if I wish a person were dead, it proves I hate them. Therefore, wishing God's laws didn't exist is wishing God didn't exist, which proves we hate him. But wait, hold on. If I have a passing thought of, I wish I didn't have to follow these rules today, is really fair for Spurgeon to equate that to wanting God completely eradicated from existence? Isn't that taking a moment of human weakness and blowing it up into an act of cosmic treason?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it feels like an extreme escalation to our modern sensibilities. But you have to understand the mechanics of God's nature in Reformed theology. God is not a politician whose policies you can dislike while still respecting the office.
Okay, so the rules and the person are tied together.
God is his law. His moral commands are not arbitrary rules he invented. They are the direct expression of his character. Therefore, you cannot separate God's rules from God's essence. If you wish the rule did not exist, you are inherently wishing that the aspect of God's character that generated that rule did not exist.
Wow.
To wish any part of God away is to wish for the destruction of the whole, because God is indivisible. Apathy toward his authority is not neutrality. To a sovereign, apathy is rebellion.
Okay, that makes theological sense, even if it's deeply uncomfortable. And Spurgeon actually anticipates that exact pushback.
Yeah.
He knows people will say, I've never consciously wished God didn't exist. So he shifts the angle of the attack and asks another, perhaps more exposing question. He asks the conscience, has your heart ever desired that God were a little less holy?
A little less rigorous. A little more willing to grade on a curve.
Exactly. He asks, have you ever wished that the things we do wrong could just be seen as venial offenses, small peccadillos? Would that he would be merciful and pass them by without requiring atonement? Would that he were not so rigorously just, so sternly strict? Have you ever wished to alter the fundamental nature of God to better accommodate your own lifestyle?
And again, the honest conscience has to plead guilty. We all naturally prefer a deity who's relaxed, who functions more like a senile grandfather who winks at our faults rather than a consuming fire of perfect justice.
And Spurgeon drops the hammer here. He says, that very wish, the desire to modify God's character, proves that you are not in love with the God who actually is. You might talk grandly about natural religion. You might hike up a mountain and boast that you reverence the god of the green fields, the rolling thunder, and the starry night.
Oh, the poetic god.
Yes, the poetic beau ideal of a deity. Spurgeon says you have constructed an idol in your mind, a fantasy that makes no moral demands on you. Because the moment you are confronted with the actual God of Scripture, the sternly just, perfectly holy, sovereign God, your immediate instinct is to change him. And in that instinct, to alter him, you prove your inherent enmity against him.
The prosecution rests. The historical evidence, the religious evidence, the testimony of the saints, and the confession of the listener's own conscience all converge on the same undeniable verdict. The carnal mind is enmity against God.
So the crime of cosmic treason is proven. But that immediately leads us to a massive question of demographics. Who exactly is guilty? We know the nature of the infection, but what is the scope of it? Does everyone have this carnal mind?
Well, we transition from the proof of the crime to the scope of the suspects. And the theological reality here is absolute. No one escapes. Spurgeon outlines the universality of this enmity in 3 distinct dimensions.
Okay, let's hear them.
The universality of persons, the universality of times, and the universality of faculties.
Let's start with the universality of persons, because he does not pull any punches here. He asserts that this enmity includes absolutely everyone, extending all the way to infants at the mother's breast. And I have to be honest, he uses a metaphor here that is just incredibly jarring. To describe the innate depravity of infants, he compares a baby to a young crocodile.
It is a striking, deeply offensive metaphor to modern ears. He paints this vivid picture of a young crocodile. He says the moment it breaks from its shell, it doesn't need to be taught how to hunt. In a moment, it puts itself in a posture of attack, opening its mouth and snapping, acting out of pure instinct.
I really want us to sit in the discomfort of this for a minute. Comparing a human infant to a snapping crocodile goes against everything in our modern psychological framework. I mean, we are heavily influenced by John Locke's tabula rasa, the idea that we are born as blank slates.
Right, or Rousseau's noble savage, that we are born inherently good, and it's society that corrupts us.
Yes. We look at a sleeping baby and we see absolute innocence. We instinctively feel that if you just raise a child right, if you give them the right education, a pious environment, love and support, they will naturally bend toward goodness. That's a tough pill to swallow, comparing a baby to a snapping crocodile. Doesn't education or a pious environment fix this?
That is the exact philosophical objection Spurgeon is anticipating. The idea that sin is merely learned behavior, a product of bad environment or imitation. Spurgeon vehemently dismantles the blank slate theory. He argues that the carnal mind is a matter of nature, not nurture. Right. He points out that you can take a child, place them under the most pious influences imaginable, let the very air they breathe be purified by piety, surround them with prayer, sacred songs, and moral instruction from birth, and that child can still grow up to become a profoundly wicked transgressor.
And experience verifies this. He notes that historically, some of the most righteous parents have had the most rebellious sons.
Because education cannot change the fundamental nature of the soul. He uses another powerful animal metaphor to hammer this home: a tamed young lion.
Oh, I like this one.
You can take a lion cub, bring it into your home, domesticate it, and feed it by hand. It might act like a house cat for a while, but it retains the wild, carnivorous nature of the forest. If you were to give it absolute liberty and expose it to the wild, it would eventually prey and kill as fiercely as any untamed lion.
It's still a lion.
Exactly. Spurgeon says you can bind a child with the green withes of education. You can restrain their outward behavior with rules, etiquette, and moral philosophy. But unless the heart is fundamentally regenerated by divine grace, the carnal mind remains underneath all that education, still at enmity against God. The crocodile is still a crocodile, even if you keep its mouth tied shut.
Wow. So he establishes that this depravity applies to the youngest, the most seemingly innocent among us. But then he takes aim squarely at the absolute opposite end of the spectrum. He points his finger at the master spirits of the age, the elites, the intellectuals, the people Victorian society practically worshipped.
Yes, the men who stand aloft like Colossi, the poets who capture the sublime, the philosophers of acute intellect who search into the deep mysteries of science. He describes them as men who slay the giant sphinx of science.
I love that phrase so much. The giant sphinx of science. It evokes this image of humanity solving the ultimate riddles of the universe. Men who can grasp the iron secrets of the eternal hills, who understand geology, astronomy, engineering, and who grind those mysteries to atoms in their fists. He is talking about the absolute peak of human intellectual and scientific achievement.
And yet he looks at the brilliant scientist, the visionary poet, the statesman, and he declares that despite their massive intellectual horsepower, their fundamental spiritual condition is identical to the snapping crocodile. The carnal mind is enmity against God.
That's quite the leveling of the playing field.
It is. You can elevate a man's intellect until it is almost angelic. You can expand his mind to comprehend the cosmos, but his heart remains depraved. Education and intellect do not cure the spiritual infection. They often just make the enmity more sophisticated.
And he doesn't just attack the secular elites. He turns his sights on the religious hypocrite as well, which must have made a lot of people in Exeter Hall shift uncomfortably in their pews.
The swinging door analogy. He describes the person who attends the house of prayer constantly, who sits under the most orthodox, clear preaching week after week. But if they haven't experienced an internal, supernatural change of heart, Spurgeon says they are no better than the wooden door of the chapel that swings in and out on its hinges.
Just going through the motions.
Yes, they possess an external, superficial religion, but the core of their being remains at war with God.
So that comprehensively covers the universality of persons. Infants, intellectual titans, and religious hypocrites, every single human being. But someone might accept that and still try to find a loophole. They might say, okay, maybe my nature is flawed. I have moments of intense rebellion. My passions definitely lead me astray sometimes. But I am not always at enmity with God. What about when I'm standing on a mountain peak watching a beautiful sunset and my heart swells with gratitude for the Creator? Or when I am overwhelmed by the beauty of a symphony? I am not an enemy of God in those moments, am I?
This brings us to the universality of times. Spurgeon anticipates this exact argument, that enmity is just an intermittent state. His response is an absolute masterclass in metaphorical reasoning, designed to show that a nature does not change its essence simply because it happens to be dormant at a given moment.
Let's give these metaphors some room to breathe because they are stunning. He starts by saying the sleeping wolf is still a wolf.
Right. It doesn't become a sheep just because it isn't currently hunting. The predatory nature is still there, just resting.
And then he talks about the snake, a serpent with beautiful azure hues, slumbering among the vibrant flowers on a warm day. It looks peaceful. It is so quiet and still that a child might reach out and stroke its slimy back without fear. But it is a serpent still. The venom is still in its fangs.
We love the aesthetic of the dormant snake in modern society. We love to look at polite society with its refined manners and cultured institutions, and we think, look how peaceful we are. But Spurgeon says the venom of human rebellion is still there. It is just temporarily sedated by social norms and favorable circumstances.
He moves from animals to nature. He says the glassy, perfectly calm sea, reflecting the blue sky without a ripple, is still the house of storms. It only takes a change in the wind to whip it into a frenzy that can sink armadas. The thunder is still rolling thunder, even when it is so high aloft we cannot hear it. And then, the quiet volcano.
The sleeping volcano.
Yeah, a volcano that hasn't erupted in centuries. Villages are built on its slopes, vineyards grow in its soil. It looks like an ordinary, fertile mountain. But when the heart of that mountain isn't belching out the lava of its corruption, when it isn't sending forth hot stones of destruction, it is still the same dread volcano.
The geological nature hasn't changed.
Right, the circumstances have simply paused the eruption.
The application is chilling. Just because you aren't actively committing a heinous crime, just because your life is currently comfortable and your passions aren't being provoked, doesn't mean your nature is friendly toward God. The carnal mind is, at all times, every single moment, inherently at enmity.
Which logically leads us to the final aspect of this section, the universality of faculties. If every person is infected at all times, what specific parts of a person are ruined? Spurgeon asks this directly. Did just the affections fall, leaving the intellect perfectly intact and pure?
You can see why a Victorian audience would want to believe this. They would argue, look at the law of gravitation, look at the steam engine, look at our railways and telegraphs. Our intellect clearly wasn't ruined in the fall. Human reason is triumphant.
Right, we're so smart now. How could our intellect be broken?
But Spurgeon dismisses all those scientific discoveries as a very mean, paltry display of wisdom compared to what man's intellect might have been and would have been in its pristine, unfallen condition. He refuses to divide the human soul. He argues that the fall of Adam crushed man entirely.
He brings back the ruined temple metaphor. He says the fall didn't just knock a few shingles off the roof. It rolled like an avalanche upon the mighty temple of human nature. Sure, if you dig through the ruins, you might find a broken flute, a beautiful pedestal, a cornice, a column that isn't completely pulverized.
The remnants of human genius.
Exactly. These are the remnants of human reason. But the entire structure collapsed. The most glorious intellectual relics of humanity are just that fallen relics leveled in the dust.
And to prove this total structural collapse, he dives deep into psychological observation. He examines the specific faculties of the mind, starting with memory.
This part hit incredibly close to home. He points out how the memory itself is fallen. He says it has an iron hand for evil, but feeble fingers for good.
The poetry of his argument here is profound. He says that memory suffers the glorious timbers from the pristine forest of Lebanon to swim down the stream of oblivion, but she stops all the draff, the refuse, the sewage that floats from the foul city of Sodom.
It is an undeniable psychological reality. Why is it that you can hear a ribald, filthy joke or a catchy but inappropriate song once, and 20 years later, when your hair is gray, that exact tune and those exact words will still jar in your ear? But you can sit through a profound lecture or hear a deeply moving note of holy praise, and it is forgotten by lunchtime. Our memory naturally, almost magnetically, retains the toxic over the pure.
He observes the exact same corruption in our affections, which constantly wander from the eternal Creator to fixate obsessively on temporary creatures. And then he turns his analytical eye to the imagination.
I was thinking about this in modern terms, and the human imagination, according to Spurgeon, functions like a broken search engine that only returns results when you type in dark, toxic data. Spurgeon argues that the imagination only truly revels and mounts with eagle's wings when it is subjected to unhealthy, abnormal conditions.
He notes how human imagination dances with wild joy when a man is drugged with opium or ardent spirits. Under the influence of intoxication, the fancy mounts up and sees visions it had never dreamed of in sobriety. And Spurgeon asks a deeply penetrating question. Why? Why didn't the imagination work with that same soaring power when the body was in a normal, healthy, pure state?
And his answer is that the imagination is depraved. It loves something that puts the physical body into a foul element. The fancy won't hold its carnival until it is intoxicated, which is a devastating critique of so much of our modern art, literature, and entertainment.
Oh, entirely.
Think about how many of the most celebrated authors, musicians, and artists produce their most splendid specimens of creativity under the accursed influence of addiction, trauma, or substance abuse. We celebrate this dark creativity as brilliance, but Spurgeon says it is just the human imagination reveling in its own brokenness.
It is a dark, comprehensive diagnosis. Every person, at every moment, in every faculty of their being, is infected with this enmity. And to cap off this entire section on universality, Spurgeon cheekily appeals to the established religious authority of his day.
Oh, I loved this part. He quotes Article 9 of the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer regarding original sin.
Yes, he jokingly calls himself the best churchman in the world, if judged by this specific article. Because Article 9 perfectly aligns with his grim diagnosis. It states that man is very far gone from original righteousness, is of his own nature inclined to evil, and that this infection of nature remains even in those who are regenerated.
So it wasn't just him being overly dramatic.
Right. He does this to prove that this doctrine of total depravity isn't just a personal theological quirk or a cynical perspective he invented. It is the historic, foundational consensus of the broader Protestant tradition.
So we have established the crime. We have proven it with history, religion, and conscience. We have shown that the infection covers every person at every time in every part of their soul. And now this deep dive has to pivot. We have to move from the clinical fact of our condition to the moral weight of it. If we accept that every human has this carnal mind at all times, doesn't that just make us victims of a bad genetic spiritual inheritance? Why does Spurgeon treat this as a crime we are deeply guilty of, rather than a spiritual disease we should just be pitied for?
This raises an important question, and it's a crucial pivot from pathology to theology. Spurgeon severely criticizes other ministers who preach sermons that only serve to humble human pride by showing our inclination to evil, but fail to press home the absolute guilt of that evil.
The difference between misery and crime. He says alienation from God isn't just a sad disability we suffer from. It is a willful sin we are guilty of. I think a lot of people today struggle with this because of the rise of therapy culture.
Oh, definitely.
We have a tendency to pathologize all our moral failings. We say, it's not treason, it's trauma. I act this way because I'm wounded, so God should look at me with pity, not judgment.
But Spurgeon insists we maintain the judicial framework. Why? Because if our state is merely a sickness that happened to us against our will, God owes us pity and healing. But if it is a willful crime, a conscious rebellion, we are subject to divine justice. We don't just need a doctor to heal our misery. We need a governor to pardon our treason. And Spurgeon wants to press home the sheer enormity of this crime by looking at the specific relation in which we stand to God.
He calls it treason against the sustainer. We have to remember we aren't just rebelling against a distant, abstract monarch who lives in another galaxy. God is the creator who actively bears up the pillars of the universe. He paints the flowers, he commands the wind, he's the active ruler of providence.
Spurgeon makes it intensely personal. He points out that God literally keeps the breath within our nostrils from moment to moment. He bids your blood pursue its course through your veins. If God were to withdraw his sustaining power for a microsecond, you would cease to exist.
I was trying to think of a mechanical analogy for this to really grasp the horror of it. So imagine you suffer a massive heart attack and go into cardiac arrest. A medic rushes over and begins performing CPR on you.
Okay, keeping you alive.
Right. They are manually pumping your heart. They are literally the only thing keeping oxygen flowing to your brain. And what are you doing? As they are violently pumping your chest to save you, you are using whatever momentary strength they give you to throw punches at their face.
Wow.
You are taking the life force they are actively supplying and weaponizing it to physically attack the one who is keeping you alive. That is the level of intimate, horrific treason Spurgeon is describing when we use the life God gives us to sin against him.
That analogy perfectly bridges into Spurgeon's next, deeply emotional point. Because God isn't just a mechanical life support system. He is a God of infinite love and benevolence. Spurgeon unleashes this interrogatory barrage that is meant to pierce the hardest heart. He focuses on the sheer irrationality of hating the all-lovely.
He turns directly to the listener and asks, "Why art thou at enmity with God? What has he done to deserve your hostility? Do you hate him because he loves you, because he feeds you and clothes you? Do you hate him because he spared your life when you were sick at the gates of death?"
He draws comparisons to earthly relationships. He asks, if an earthly benefactor fed you every day, would you hate him? If he clothed you when you were naked, would you abuse him to his face? If a mother nursed you on her knee, do you hate her? Now, we view ingratitude to earthly benefactors as a deep moral failing. And yet, humanity instinctively spurns the ever-beneficent God who gives infinitely more.
It highlights the diabolical, almost satanic enormity of returning enmity for absolute love. And Spurgeon brings it to the ultimate climax. The greatest proof of this love is that God sent his son from his own bosom to hang on a Roman tree and bleed to death for the sins of rebels. And humanity's response is to hate him for that. Spurgeon calls it an iniquity for which words fail in description. It is the ultimate perversion of the soul to despise the essentially good.
The enormity of the guilt is fully established. The diagnosis is terminal. The guilt is absolute, undeniable, and indefensible. We have been dragged down to the very bottom of the spiritual abyss. And when you reach this point in Reformed theology, the natural, desperate question is, what is the solution? Where on earth do we go from here?
We have to move to the deductions and doctrines, the verdict and the cure. If everything Spurgeon has said about the carnal mind is true, it forces some very specific, unavoidable conclusions about how salvation must mechanically work.
The first and most obvious deduction is the absolute death of human merit. If we are fundamentally, essentially enemies of God, salvation cannot possibly be achieved by our own works.
Right. What possible merit can an active enemy have? But this is where the modern self-help bootstrap mentality pushes back hard. Society tells us that if we just put in the work, if we practice mindfulness, if we do enough good deeds, we can balance the cosmic scales and fix ourselves.
But Spurgeon dismantles the scale entirely. He points out that even unfallen Adam, when he was completely pure in Eden and kept all the laws perfectly, was still just an unprofitable servant. He didn't build up a surplus of merit. He simply did what he was obligated to do as a creature.
So no extra credit.
Exactly. So if a perfect, sinless human couldn't earn extra merit, how much less could an active, rebellious enemy ever hope to earn favor by throwing a few good deeds at the creator they are currently at war with?
He quotes a saying from a minister named Matthew Wilkes, which perfectly captures the sheer absurdity of a works-based salvation for an enemy. I love this quote. Wilkes said, "Saved by your works, you might as well try to go to America in a paper boat."
It's a fantastic, almost comical image of complete futility. You build your little paper boat of good deeds, you set it on the raging Atlantic Ocean of God's justice, and it is destined to dissolve and sink immediately. Spurgeon also compares the legalist, the person exhausting themselves trying to earn their way to heaven, to a blind horse walking round and round a mill, or a prisoner forced to walk on a treadwheel.
It's just walking in circles.
To suss yourself, you work and sweat, but at the end of the day, you step off the treadwheel, and you're exactly where you started, no higher than before. and your conscience always whispers the terrifying truth. This is not perfection. It ought to have been better.
So, if the paper boat sinks, salvation for enemies must be accomplished by an ambassador, by a substitute, by an atonement. It must be entirely by grace. But that leads to the second necessary deduction, which I think is perhaps the most philosophically profound point in the whole sermon. It is the absolute necessity of a new nature.
Yes, the concept of the enemy in heaven.
Spurgeon imagines this impossible hypothetical scenario. What if an unregenerate man, a man whose carnal mind is still fully at enmity with God, actually got his wish? What if he was allowed into heaven without his nature being changed? Because so many people think, oh, if I just ask for mercy on my deathbed, God will let me into heaven and everything will be great. But Spurgeon forces us to look at the psychological reality of what heaven actually is.
He describes this unregenerate man coming within the pearly gates. The man hears a massive, beautiful song of praise echoing through the streets, but he realizes it is a sonnet praising his enemy. He sees a glorious throne, but seated on it is the God he despises. The streets of gold, the hosts of angels, the entire atmosphere of the place, it all revolves entirely around his enemy.
He wouldn't even know the tune of the song. He would stand there, silent, alienated, and completely miserable. You brought up a quote from George Whitefield that Spurgeon references, and when you really unpack the psychology of it, it is chilling but perfectly logical.
Whitefield said that an unregenerate man would be so desperately unhappy in heaven that he would ask God to let him run down to hell for shelter.
Let him run down to hell for shelter. Because heaven is only heaven if your nature has been fundamentally changed to love the King of Heaven. If you inherently resent the King, being trapped in his throne room for all eternity, surrounded by billions of people singing his praises, unable to escape his holy presence, that wouldn't be paradise. It would be the ultimate suffocating psychological torture. You would beg for the darkness just to escape the light.
Exactly. The joy of heaven is proximity to God. If you hate God, proximity is punishment. Therefore, before a person can ever enjoy heaven, there must be a radical change of nature. The carnal mind must be destroyed and replaced. But here's the final, crucial, terrifying point of mechanics. Can the carnal mind change itself?
And based on everything we've discussed, the crocodile, the noun versus adjective, the ruined temple, the answer has to be a resounding no. An enemy might choose to put down his weapons and sign a peace treaty, but enmity itself cannot transform into friendship. Blackness cannot command itself to turn into light. Corruption cannot birth purity.
The change requires a power completely outside of human capacity. It requires the supernatural intervention of the Holy Spirit. Spurgeon insists that if you try to change yourself, if you reform your habits and try to make yourself better 1,000 times over, you will never be fit for heaven until God's Spirit has forcibly laid his hand upon your soul and new-made the man from the ground up.
So what does this all mean for the listener? We've walked through this devastating diagnosis, the utter inability of man to save himself, the futility of human merit, the absolute necessity of the Holy Spirit. After stripping away every ounce of human pride and self-reliance, where does Spurgeon leave this massive audience at Exeter Hall?
He ends with a final desperate call. Having broken their pride, he points them to the only possible cure. He points to an ancient Old Testament narrative. Moses lifting up the brazen serpent in the wilderness.
Right. For those who might not know the story, the Israelites in the desert were rebelling, and God sent venomous snakes among them. People were being bitten and were dying in agony, but God didn't tell them to go to a laboratory and concoct an antidote. He don't tell them to do good works to earn their healing. He told Moses to fashion a bronze snake, put it on a high pole, and promise that anyone who was bitten simply had to look at it and they would live.
And Spurgeon uses this as the ultimate pristine picture of the mechanics of gospel grace. He speaks directly to the trembling, self-condemned sinner who finally realizes they are a ruined temple, deeply bitten by the venom of their own enmity. He says to them, look to Jesus Christ on the cross. The command isn't to work. It isn't to earn. It isn't to figure out how to fix your carnal mind. The command is simply look.
One look will save. He quotes the hymn, venture on him, venture wholly, let no other trust intrude. It is the profound realization that you are completely helpless, completely bankrupt, and your only hope is to look outside yourself to the perfect sacrifice provided by the very God you are at war with.
It is a remarkable, exhausting, and ultimately beautiful journey he takes the listener on. He drags them from the majestic heights of unfallen Eden down into the deepest, darkest, most uncomfortable realities of human depravity. He proves their guilt in the undeniable courtroom of their own conscience, systematically destroys any hope of self-salvation, and finally, when they have nowhere else to turn, points them to the cross as the only possible cure.
It really is a masterclass in theology and rhetoric. It forces you to reevaluate everything about how you view yourself and your world. But before we wrap up this session, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, building on something we discussed earlier regarding the universality of our ruin.
Ah, the fallen nature of the imagination.
Yes. Spurgeon argued that our imagination requires abnormal, toxic conditions to truly mount up with eagle's wings, because it is inherently depraved. It naturally retains the draft of Sodom while letting the pure cedars of Lebanon float down the stream of oblivion.
It's a sobering thought.
I want you to consider your own daily media consumption, the art you love, and the creative inputs you feed your mind. How much of what we consider brilliant, edgy, or creative in our modern culture is actually just the human imagination reveling in its own brokenness?
Right, celebrating the corruption.
Exactly. If our memory naturally holds on to the toxic and lets the pure slip away, how does that change the intentionality with which you guard your own mind today? What are you feeding your imagination?
That is a deeply convicting question, and one that proves how relevant this 19th century text remains today.
It really is, because at the end of the day, we all want the spiritual x-ray to show a clean, simple break that we can just put a cast on and fix ourselves. We want a simple, flattering diagnosis. But the truth is much deeper and much more severe. The machine isn't just broken, the patient is actively at war. But the incredibly good news is that the doctor has provided a cure that doesn't rely on the patient's merit. It only requires a look. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on reformed thinking. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep looking for the truth.